It is my privilege to welcome you all to today's Bitrise webinar. Today, we're going to talk about code coverage metrics, best practices, and generally speaking, how to establish a code coverage benchmark for your team. First of all, let me introduce Tom Hu to you, who is going to be in the limelight today. He's the one who's going to do the talking and provide the value to you, not me, essentially. Tom
And the
leads
DJing, of course,
and the
right?
DJing, that's much more important. Yeah. So Tom leads developer relations at Codecov, helping developers implement code coverage directly in their workflow. He is madly passionate about clean code and arming developer teams to make informed decisions about their code. So he is going to give you the presentation about and like his best knowledge about code coverage. That's what you can expect from today's webinar. We'll jump into the detailed agenda shortly. There's just one more thing I wanted to mention before we get started, and that is just wanted to remind you that feel free to ask questions during the webinar. After the presentation and the demo part, we are going to have a live Q&A. So whenever you have any questions, just drop a line in the chat or use the Q&A tool built into Zoom. So we'll get back to those questions, and Tom is hopefully going to provide insightful answers for those questions.
That's the goal.
Awesome. So
Awesome.
I think then if we don't have anything formal to discuss, I'm going to hand it over to Tom now so I can sit back and learn.
Great. Thanks so much, Janusz. So yeah, I'm really happy that all of you are here, either live or watching later. And I hope that we'll be able to teach you something interesting today about code coverage and how to set it up in your organizations. So with this webinar, we hope that you're going to take away three things. First, you'll understand what code coverage is and what it isn't. We'll talk about how coverage is calculated and why it's important in your developer workflows. Then we'll learn how to implement code coverage in your organizations and the steps you should take to be successful. And finally, we'll show you how to start collecting coverage metrics from Bitrise to Codecov so that you can get set up quickly. Now, we'll accomplish this by first overviewing what is code coverage. We'll use that time to talk about why it's used and how it can be integrated into your projects. We'll move over to talking about the idea of hitting 100% coverage and discussing whether or not that's actually beneficial. And I'll spend a little more time talking about some tactics of collecting useful metrics and introduce Codecov's flag feature. From there, we'll do a quick demo showing you how to quickly set up using Codecov on Bitrise, and we'll close by talking about how to start using code coverage at your organizations. But first, Janusz and I would like to introduce Bitrise and Codecov in case you are unfamiliar with either of those two products.
Yeah, thank you. So what we haven't figured out is that since you are sharing your screen, I won't be able to control the slides, but then we'll get over that. So if you are,
you could say next or slide or anything like that.
Thank you.
It's going to be great.
If you're not familiar with Bitrise, we are a CICD built for specifically for mobile. That's our sole focus. We help you build and operate better mobile apps faster. So to compare to other CI/CD solutions, there are plenty of them out there. Of course, we are solely focused on mobile. So that's I'm going to briefly explain how we do that here at Bitrise. So what's the problem? What's the unique challenge about building mobile apps? First of all, it is always changing. Users expect continuous iteration, and there are plenty of tools and dependencies changing all the time. Next thing is that it's immensely fragmented. There are plenty of devices, operating systems, plenty of different screen sizes to work with. You have to test and optimize for all of those. which is a tedious task, even if you automate the majority of it. And mobile is unforgiving of mistakes. There's no undo button. Once you publish something in the App Store, it's going to go live. So you really have to be thorough, and it's going to cost you a lot of money if you make mistakes. And those are the problems that Bitrise is trying to solve essentially. Can you go on to the next one, please? So those are the challenges. And just one more, please. That's where Bitrise comes in. We have built a platform to help you get over all of those challenges and make it easier to release and maintain your apps. And we do that through a series of workflows and steps. Could you just hit next once more? And just one more. Again, I just want to skip these. So, and one more. I'm just going to skip. Like, I don't want to be, the promoter here. So how it works, how we solve that, we automate the process by building it into steps and workflows. And these digitized processes are faster, more efficient, and with the steps and workflows that we've built Bitrise around, help you integrate all of the tools that you need to use in your mobile development workflow. So like in the case of Codecov, if you're using Codecov for code coverage, with the Codecov step that is built and maintained by the Codecov team, you can integrate it out of the box. It takes a minute to set up. So you can integrate like hundreds of external solutions, external service providers into your build process. Basically, that's how we are trying to solve this problem for you. And then I'd like to hand it over back to Tom to talk about Codecov.
Awesome. Thanks, Janusz. I love seeing how there's more.
Oh, sorry. It's just like, yeah, that there are, as I mentioned, there are hundreds of steps that you can use. I just forgot to, yeah, it's all yours from now.
No, it's all good. I think when we were first getting involved and building out the Codecov step on Bitrise, and I remember the first time I implemented it, and it was so easy and so quick. I was absolutely amazed, and I'm really excited. Later on in the webinar, we'll actually do a demo to show you how quick and easy it is to get set up. But anyways, I love seeing how Bitrise really helps mobile developers with the automation, of all these really time-consuming steps. At Codecov, we try to have a process of code coverage that fits directly in a developer's workflow, so they can quickly identify code that's untested. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Codecov, we were launched in 2015 as a dedicated code coverage tool used extensively from small open source public projects all the way up to large institutions. We're language agnostic, and we're dedicated to being free for open source now and forever. And we really pride ourselves with building features that help our users stay in their own workflow so that they can get back to the things that they do best. So with that, we come back to the main topic of our webinar, and that's what is code coverage? Well, the main problem that code coverage solves is, how do I, as the engineer, know that my code is well tested? I know that when I'm writing out a new feature, I want to make sure that all the functionality actually works. Or if I'm removing old code, I want to be sure that my critical code paths are still being tested. So what tools do I have at my disposal to be confident in the code that I'm actually deploying? So this is exactly what code coverage is meant to do. Code coverage is just a metric that lets you know what lines of code get hit during a run of your test suites. So what that means is you can aggregate this information together as a single value, which represents the percentage of lines of code that have a test versus the total number of lines of code in your code base. So this tells you two things. First, it lets you see which lines of code are actually being run during your test suite. And second, it gives you an objective number for how well your code is being tested. So what does this actually look like if you're a developer? So here's an example of the Codecov UI. I pull up a file from one of our repos, and this is basically what a coverage report will look like for a developer on our website. And you have the code being overlaid with coverage information. Green lines are lines that are covered or code that's actually tested. Red is for mislines. So these are lines of code that have no tests that touch them. This is typically where developers will look to know where to add tests. And we also have yellow for partial hits, or when only some branches are hit in a conditional or in a loop. So in other words, only some or none of a condition is actually being tested. And this is really useful to ensure that you are testing all sides of an if statement or an else statement or whatnot. But for most users, they care about this number, that 87.88%, because at the end of the day, they want to know if they've maintained, increased, or decreased their total code coverage. So whether or not they have actually written enough tests or they actually need to add more. So shouldn't that mean that 100% coverage is a good thing, that all of your code is being tested against? Well, if you go on Reddit and you do a quick search for 100% code coverage, you'll get hundreds of these articles and comments talking about why you should or you shouldn't. And the same is true for any other developer forum like Stack Overflow or Hacker News. If you talk to developers, they're extremely opinionated about 100% coverage. And some will tell you it's absolutely vital, while others will say it's just a vanity metric. So I wanted to spend some time discussing the pros and cons so that you understand when it's necessary. So as we mentioned, 100% coverage means that all of your code is being tested. But more importantly, this means that all of your code has actually run. So this is actually extremely useful because it means that there are paths to all of your code, which results in a lot less dead code. It means that if you write new code, it'll help identify regressions or features that aren't being tested. Another benefit to having high code coverage is that developers are likely following best testing practices. So this means that, for example, flaky tests have been removed and that third-party API calls have been properly mocked out. 100% code coverage also means, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, that your syntax errors are likely resolved, that your semicolons are where they need to be, and all your variables are spelled correctly. But there's a lot of flaws with having 100% coverage. So writing tests for all your code is extremely time consuming. As an engineer, we estimate that writing tests can take as much time as the actual implementation. And code is never perfect. If it suits a particular use case now, it's highly unlikely that it's going to be suitable 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now. Because the decisions on the models and the views don't always work out when you begin to support more features. And so all of this is to say that writing tests for edge case code can be extremely time intensive, so much so that the test may be written for code that no longer is relevant, particularly at a fast moving early startup. So as you probably know, a covered line of code also doesn't mean that the test running against it is perfect. So setting an organization standard of 100% coverage without proper reasoning can lead developers to write poor quality tests in order to hit some vanity metric. Now, all that really is to say that high quality tests will always trump a high coverage value. Code coverage should be used as a tool to figure out what parts of your code base need tests, namely high quality tests. So if code coverage is a tool, how can I use it to better test my code? So we talked already about how blindly hitting for 100% coverage over your entire code base isn't really a good idea. But the reality of code is that not all of it is created equal. So for example, I might be more concerned that my billing code is really well tested as opposed to some small UI feature. And often, the more aligned code is to a business goal, the more likely it needs to be well tested. So instead of covering all of your code, we encourage our users to isolate their code based on features or test systems. Now, if you're building a small hobby project with no expectation to scale, code coverage may be a little overkill. But as code complexity increases, there are easy ways to break down the system into its parts. So at Codecov, we have a feature called flags to help encapsulate different directories and files along with the coverage report. And this allows our users to break coverage into parts of the system that matters the most. We also give users the power to prevent code merges if a certain level of coverage isn't reached for every flag. So what are some ways to actually isolate systems in order to use flags? So an example of code isolation, we have a repository that collects coverage for its backend and its front-end files. Here we see that the code base files have been split according to these designations. So we see this use case all the time. In particular, we'll deal with an organization that requires having a stable backend. And this may be due to the nature or the maturity of the code base and product. And maybe they have a lot of critical services that just need a lot of high uptime. However, the front end is in flux. So we have a lot of organizations that move their front end from one framework to another or adopt a totally different vertical. While front end code, so in this case, the expectation is that backend code never drops below 60% overall coverage, while front end code is expected to only increase over time because it's on some new framework. So separating the code base this way allows for more granular control of coverage and the necessary blocking of untested code. However, we don't always need to split coverage based on files. So many of our users have different test suites that they run on their code bases on the same files. So in this case, a project runs separate unit tests and integration tests. In this particular example, we see that unit test coverage is at 100%. However, this user might only need integration coverage to reach the critical code paths. So for them, 80% is adequate. Flags can help separate these two types of coverage to ensure that integration tests are not inappropriately inflated by the results of running unit tests. Finally, flags can be extremely helpful for users with monorepos. So in this example, we see that the main repository is split into 3 projects, project A, B, and C. And these 3 projects can be completely separate from each other, working independently. And so as a developer on project A, I might not know or care about the coverage metrics on project B or C. So displaying coverage for all 3 projects without flags as one large number isn't meaningful, as one project may not be as strict with their coverage, leading to large coverage drops. In this case, we see that project B has very low coverage, for whatever reason that might be, and this would adversely affect the other 2 projects. So using flags on each module allows these projects to outline their own processes for adequate code coverage and determine when code can and should be merged in. Great, so now we're gonna move over to a demo. I have a demo repository that I'm going to use, and currently it's already set up on Bitrise to run tests and code coverage. So we're gonna take a look at that now. Great. So we're going to be using Python. I'm a Python developer, so I'm a little bit biased towards that. But Codecov is language agnostic, so you can use whatever language you would like to. So in this repository, we have a package awesome and a test file test.py. So I'm going to click into test.py just to show what sort of test that we're running. And you'll see that we have a test class with 2 test cases. And these will check to ensure that the 2 functions smile and frown return the correct values. So from here, I'm going to move over to Bitrise to sort of show what that looks like in our actual build right now. So I have this repository set up. Oh, the wrong repository. It's kidding. It's live demo. Anything can happen. I believe it's this one. Perfect. So moving on to Bitrise here, I'm going to show the most recent build and what that actually looks like. So I've added some things in the do anything script. This is just sort of boilerplate code, but what it will do is install some packages and run the tests, as you can see here. Codecov is going to take the output of that run as its input. So let's go ahead and let's add the Codecov step to see what that looks like. So I'm going to open up the workflow editor, and I'm going to show you how to add the Codecov step in 2 ways. As Janusz mentioned earlier, the step library is awesome. It was so easy for me to set this up the first time around. So I'm going to show it that way first, and then we'll talk about how to do this if you have a Bitrise YAML file instead. So opening up the workflow editor, I'm going to go here. And as I mentioned earlier, we want to do this after coverage has been collected by your test run. So I'm going to click the plus sign here. I'm going to search for Codecov, and Zoom's in the way. I need to click all. And so I'm going to click this one, and aha. So we get to our first roadblock. And right here, it's asking for a Codecov token. And so Codecov has a secret token that we use for uploads. And this you can get to by going to the Codecov UI, which I have a tab open for. So when you log into Codecov for the first time, you'll see a list of your repositories, and you click on a repository. This is the page that you're going to see. Now I'm going to copy this upload token, and I'm going to go back to Bitrise, and I'm going to input it in here. Now you can put anything as the key. I think we prefer it to be just codecov_token. I'm going to input the value here, and I'm going to click on add new. Okay, cool. So that part's done. So after this, we should be all set up, and that's how easy it is. Now you'll see this other field here for additional options. So the Bitrise step serves as a wrapper for our bash uploader. So if you're looking for more customization, you can view that information in the Codecov documentation. Okay, so I'm going to save and rerun this workflow so we can see a full run of it and see what happens when Codecov is now integrated. Did it? Yeah, it's saved. Awesome. So while that's running, I'm just going to point out what this looks like in the Bitrise YAML file. Awesome. So we see here in the Bitrise YAML file that's added these 3 lines. It's super simple. That's really all you need to do, and it should work exactly the same. So if you're looking to do this on your own repository and you have a Bitrise YAML file, you can just add these lines of code, and it should work as expected. So going back to the workflows now, hopefully it ran. If it didn't, then I'll just force it to run. 28 second. Oh, wait, nah, did this just run? I'm not sure. Doesn't matter. We're going to start a new build. Start the build. As you can see, not yet a pro Bitrise user. But we'll see that it loads up. Everything looks good so far. Crossing my fingers, you never know what's going to happen on a live demo. Step 1. Step 2, collecting coverage. And then step 3 should be the Codecov step. Haha, yay, it ran. So let's take a look at what actually happened in the Codecov step. So we have this bash uploader, which, as I mentioned, the Bitrise step wraps around, and we have all these log files, which are really great. But what's most interesting to me is this last line here. So I'm really curious about the reports. So I'm going to copy this URL, and I'm going to open a tab and click that. And let's see what it looks like. Okay, so you'll notice that we have an 84.21% coverage, and that's mentioned right here at the top right. And so this means that we probably have some work to do. Now I can go into the files and see what lines aren't covered. I can also see them here because this is actually a first run of the repository to spit out coverage. But I'm going to go into the files here, and I'll notice that, oh, great, test.py, that looks fully covered. But I have some work to do in this file, awesome/init.py. And we can take a look, and Codecov will point out which lines of code are being covered, as I mentioned before, with these green lines. And we also see that we have, oh, there are these 3 functions that aren't being run and they don't have tests run against them. So now, because this wasn't run as a PR, but most of you will probably interact with Codecov directly in GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket, I'm going to go to another PR that I created earlier just to show you a little bit more about how Codecov tries to stay in a developer's workflow. So I believe I have this. Great. And so the first thing you'll notice is that I open this PR and that you see this comment from Codecov. So this is going to appear on all PRs unless it's configured otherwise. but it gives developers and reviewers a quick way to see how coverage is being affected. Now, of course, this is the very first coverage report on a repository. So what you'll see here is that it says no coverage uploaded for pull request base. And that's just because there's nothing yet to compare to. This is the first coverage report that was uploaded to Codecov. We'll also see that Codecov provides status checks. So I can show all checks, and there's one for patch and one for project. Just to explain those a little bit, project coverage is for the entire code base. So you would see that as that 84.21% that I showed earlier. Patch coverage, as we'll also talk about a little bit later, is actually the coverage for all of the code that you have added. So as a developer, I might be creating a new feature, and I want to make sure that my new feature is fully tested. So I want that patch value to be at 100%. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the entire code base coverage is at 100%. And so as you can see, you can also click on these details over here, and that'll just give you a little bit more information on the Codecov UI. So getting started with Codecov can be extremely quick and easy to get coverage metrics where they matter. So I'm going to head back to the presentation now. And the question that we get asked all the time is, how do I start doing the right things with code coverage? Just having the numbers is nice, but it's not really going to help move our organization forward. So we compiled a list of steps that we think are suitable for most projects. Now, the first step, of course, is to start gathering coverage metrics and uploading them to Codecov. So we won't be able to establish a baseline without doing this first. We're going to move on from this step as we've discussed already how to do this. Now, you'll remember the demo that Codecov offers status checks on your PRs. So we recommend making these non-blocking checks. Now, this is to ensure that developers get used to seeing coverage on their PRs. They also get used to seeing the comment on their PRs and can understand what coverage looks like at that time. And you can do this by going to the configuration for Codecov and making status checks informational only. Now, after your developers have developed a sense for what coverage looks like, we recommend making the patch status blocking. So as I mentioned before, patch coverage measures only the coverage of the lines that were changed, not of the entire code base. So again, this means that as a developer writing code, I only have to be worried about writing tests for my changes. So we use this step as a way to build the muscle for writing tests. And we recommend a high value for this status check, maybe 70% or above. And that's really just to ensure that developers get in the habit of writing good tests. So after developers have begun to write tests for a while, we think it's time for organizations to evaluate what a reasonable coverage number looks like. So depending on where you're coming from, this could be 40%, it could be 70%, it could even be 100%. But what matters is that the developers are in agreement to enforce that value to find swaths of critical, untested code. So we encourage teams to use Codecov flags to help here, as some teams may have much more mature code that is better tested. Now, at some point, organizations are going to reach the goals set in that previous step. So we recommend continuing to pursue more coverage or to maintain that certain level. And status checks can be used here to ensure that coverage continues to go up or that coverage is always maintained at a certain level. Awesome. With that, we're going to open for Q&A. I'm going to leave open this last slide just as a quick summary of what we just talked about today. Janusz, whenever you're ready, we can do this.
Awesome. Thanks for the insightful presentation. As Tom mentioned, now it's time for your questions in case you have any.
Oh, GitHub has dark theme. I didn't know that. That's really awesome to know.
The most important feedback was about you being professional barbarian, not using GitHub with the dark theme.
That's embarrassing. I'm so sorry.
Now we've got some great questions in the Q&A. So we'll just dive into those right now. So
just a note, Janusz, I actually can't see the Q&A right now, so just read them off. We'll answer as best as we can.
Okay, we'll do. So the first one is from Andres. For Android, do you guys use Jacoco to generate the
Yes.
test results file
Yeah.
that Codecov uses?
So Jacoco will generating Jacoco files is actually the input that Codecov will take in. That's something that we support. So if that is your typical process right now, the bash uploader, or in this case, the Bitrise step, should be able to pick that up automatically and run whatever coverage stuff that it needs to on our backend.
Great, lovely. Now, Andres also had another question about if there's a Codecov setup tutorial for Android. Could you point him in the right direction?
So I don't believe we have an Android specific setup, but that is something that will definitely be on top of my mind that hopefully will get done by the end of the year. It's this December, yes. We're closing in. Thank you so much for that feedback.
So what's the best thing they can do right now?
For sure. So it should be fairly easy. If you are already creating Jacoco files, Jacoco coverage reports, all you really need to do is add that Bitrise step in order to get that coverage uploaded to Codecov. I'm not familiar enough on how that process works, so I can't really comment on that. But again, we'll make an example repository quickly in order for you to be able to get up and running quickly.
We just got a question from
and you absolutely can help write a guide.
Yeah,
my email is tom@codecov.io. Please feel free to email me, get in touch. We'd love any help here because, of course, we want to make sure that Codecov is easy to set up, especially if you're a Bitrise user.
Amazing. Now the next one, do we have an output environment variable to get the report from Codecov?
So when you upload a coverage report to Codecov, it is possible to get the report. So there are a couple ways that you can do this. If you remember in the Codecov step, when you're adding that token, you'll see that there's a place for additional options. So one of those additional options is to write that to file before it's sent to Codecov, and the other one is write to standard out as opposed to uploading. So it's more just like a dry run kind of feature. So those are the ways that you can do it through the Bitrise step. The other way you can do that is after a coverage report has been uploaded to Codecov successfully, you can, and actually why not just show that? How do I get out of here? Okay. So we looked at this a little bit earlier, but you can go to the build tab and you can click download. And so you can download the coverage report. This one was really simple, as I mentioned, and it's also Python, so it's not Jacoco, it's just a coverage.py coverage report. But you can take a look and see the coverage report there. So two different ways to do that.
Awesome. Now
I'm going to do this because now I can see the Q&A.
Lovely. So the next one is from Chris. Is there a way to create Codecov flags based on class naming patterns? So for example, some teams may want to start writing great tests for view models.
So right now, flags are specific to, are more specific to files, and they don't go to the depth of classes or functions. So if you happen to have all of your view models in the same file or directory, you can do it that way. Can flags be combined? I'm not exactly sure what the use case you were trying to do with that would be. You can specify flags in however way that you want at a file level or a directory level. So if you decide that, oh, these two directories are really part of the same overall structure or overall feature, you can just edit the configuration on Codecov in order to show that. Let me know if that doesn't make sense.
Wonderful. Let's just wait for some follow-up on that. In the meantime, we've got another one from Matthew. In Codecov, can you actually configure enforcement via status checks for only ever increasing project coverage?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the features that that we add to the configuration of status checks, I'm trying to think about the best way to explain this. So the first way you can always do coverage is by saying, oh, like it must hit 70% or it must hit, whatever X percent. But we also have something called auto. And so what auto means is that it has to be equal or better to whatever the most recent coverage value was. So let's say I make a feature, it's awesome, I deploy it, and my repository is now at 37% coverage. The next developer comes in and is like, oh, great, like I'm just gonna write a whole bunch of code and not test it out. It must reach that 38, did I say 38 or 37? I can't remember anymore. But whatever number I said, it must reach that coverage value or higher in order to be accepted by the status check. One of the best use cases for that is actually when people are starting off using Codecov for the first time. And so an organization will say that, hey, like we know our coverage isn't great, or maybe it is really great. But in the case that it's not really great, that's fine. Let's just continue getting better from there. And so they'll use that auto step in order to increase their coverage slowly in order to, I don't know, be from 10% to 90%.
Wonderful.
Usually when,
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No,
I was going to say, usually when an organization feels really comfortable, which is, I believe that's step 5 that I was talking about, they get to that 80% or that 90% or 60%, whatever it is, that's when they might switch from auto back to a hard number. We also allow some wiggle room. So there's another configuration where it's like, oh, yeah, but if you drop like 0.01%, like it's fine. It's not a big deal. Maybe it's a really large code base. You deleted a lot of lines of code. You shouldn't get dinged for that. So there is an allowance of wiggle room in case you need it.
With that in mind, could you like drop me like a number? Is there like a silver bullet? Like what's the number? Like for example, what's the benchmark for the Codecov team, or is it just like depends on a lot of things, so it's different for every team?
I'll be honest, it really is dependent on what sort of team it is. I can give like some general guidelines, but of course, please take everything with a grain of salt because it really just depends on where you are as an organization and how you sort of value code coverage. For really critical pieces, like I mentioned our billing code before, we do really want that to be well tested so that it is really close to 100% coverage. Things that are really close to a database, things that deal with really sensitive data or with monetary transactions, we really highly recommend at least like 90% for those, if not 100. For things that are an API layer that maybe they interact with a third-party API, those can come and go. It could be 70%. For things that are really in flux, like let's say you're testing out a brand new feature, you're trying to move quickly, you're a pre-seed or a seed stage startup, and you're like, oh, we don't even have product market fit yet. Then maybe you're not looking for 70% because that's crazy. Maybe in 3 months you'll be like, oh, we have a completely different product now. So maybe like 20% or 40% is more interesting to you. So it really just depends on where you are as an organization and how close to quote unquote critical that code is going to be.
It's quite an interesting insight what you mentioned about the like fast moving seed stage startups, because like if I totally get that, like you want to move fast, but then like 3 months from now you could end up with a huge tech debt later on. So like you have to find that balance probably. But yeah, I'm with you 100%. Another one, following up on what Chris asked, what is the suggested solution to flag all the view models?
Yeah, so this is a little bit interesting, and it's interesting because it also depends on how you are doing your coverage. So what that means is that if I'm running a bunch of different suites all as one, and I get to a point where it's like, great, I ran everything, and that sorry, words are hard. If I'm only uploading one coverage report, what's important is that you go into the Codecov configuration file and you specify, hey, these are the paths that matter for this particular flag. So let's say I only upload one coverage report and it's for everything, but I only really care about the flagging it for the view models, for example. I would go into the Codecov configuration file and I would say, great, like here's the flag, it's called view models, and these are the paths or directories that I care about. Now, let's say that's not necessarily true. And let's say you're uploading a coverage report for your view models, and then you have a coverage report for something else, and you have a coverage report for your backend, whatever it ends up being. You can then upload a coverage report and flag that single coverage report that has the view model code that you care about. The one big nuance to this is, let's say that you care about a lot of different things and you have a lot of different flags and you only upload one coverage report. So this is a little bit tricky, and it's only tricky because of the way that this is sort of set up. And that use case would be that, let's say I have something for view models, and let's say something I just have a flag for models and I have a flag for views, whatever it happens to be. You would have to upload that coverage report multiple times with each different flag. And that's just to make sure that Codecov understands where that coverage report is coming from and how to attribute that to the right paths.
Sweet, thank you. And I think that leaves us with no questions unanswered. There was just one more from Gregory that I'll attend to. Will the recording be shared? Absolutely. We will be in touch with you with the recording shortly after the webinar. And we just got one more. Is it possible to get the code coverage and Bitrise workflow and retrieve this info to GitLab?
I think I understand the question, and please correct me if I'm wrong. So, of course, this presentation was definitely more GitHub focused, but we support GitLab completely as well. So if you use Bitrise and use GitLab and you're implementing the Codecov step onto your CICD or your Bitrise workflow, it should also just work with GitLab as well. That shouldn't be a problem.
Lovely. We'll just wait for 1 or 2 moments to see if there's any follow-up on that. But if not, then leaves us truly with no questions unanswered, no stone unturned. So that's going to be a wrap then.
Surprised no one asked about my DJing skills.
I'll be in touch with you for my friend's wedding next
Sounds
year.
good.
I'll be in touch. Cool.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks, Andres and Anas and everyone else. That's a wrap then. Thank you all for joining our webinar. I hope that you learned just as much as I did. And thank you, Tom, for the insightful presentation and answering all the questions that you had to face today.